Hello and welcome to Inspiral Out Loud. This is where we are having conversations around how to foster a thriving future for all sentient beings through creativity, wellness, and regeneration. So today we're at I think we're at number 5 now for Inspiral Out Loud, and I'm happy to have Mars with me here again to have a chat. G'day Mars, how are you going?
Hi Tony, I'm good. How's yourself?
Very well, thank you. Some of you might have seen a new David Icke interview that was released on YouTube, and it was pulled down, I think, within a few hours of it going up. And it was about his take on the current COVID-19 situation. And I just thought it might be quite an interesting focal point for us to chat about today. So before we actually get into that, though, I feel like it's important to just cover a few things around the type of information that you might be taking in and whether it's actually in service to yourself or not. And the reason that I say that is depending on your situation at home. If you're currently in a state of fear, in a state of dis-ease, and you're feeling fragile at all, it might not be the best medicine for you to go down this route. And I just say that from personal experience, that if you feel like your connection to self is strong at the moment, and that knowledge is power to you, then you might actually be interested in watching this interview. And I will have a link to it at the end. We're just going to have a chat about that first. So David Icke has been known in conspiracy type circles for about 30 years. And he was definitely laughed at and ridiculed a huge amount, especially in the earlier part of his career. He is finding now, 3 decades later, that a lot of people that were putting him down are actually now asking him for advice. Some of his ideas are pretty out there, I've got to say, and I don't necessarily subscribe to all of them, but like with anybody, I do find a lot of his ideas quite interesting. Mars, what's your take on David Icke?
Well, I started listening to David Icke when I first started getting into the whole world of truth finding, truth seeking. And I got to say, I agree with you. He does have some very out there ideas, and I think he's realized in more recent times that it's not effective to talk about things that are so beyond people's reach. It basically means he puts off a lot of people from listening to otherwise what I think is pretty good information, particularly when it comes to, the sort of meat and potatoes conspiracy world. He tends to provide a lot of his source references, as you would expect from anyone who wants to be taken seriously. I think the problem isn't his research. The problem can be sometimes putting pieces of a puzzle together can be sometimes wrong. And when you start from a certain perspective, when you're trying to assemble this vast amount of information into a coherent picture of trying to understand how the world works and how people operate, sometimes if you put key pieces of information in the wrong place, so to speak, you get a very different picture than you otherwise would. So it can be a bit of a minefield to get through all of that. So I say he's a little bit like a few others that are very public, that they're a good place to start from, but I wouldn't take their conclusions at face value. But I've got to say, I have an enormous respect for David Icke for the simple fact that he plowed through absolute ridicule and shaming in such a public way. And all he was really trying to do was just say, there's a problem here, guys. Wake up. And, you know, I've seen him do presentations that are sometimes 10 hours long on stage. I mean, he's an old man now, and he's still doing this.
Yeah.
That kind of commitment I have never seen it anywhere else.
And I was just thinking today, you know, like some people say, well, he's just trying to sell books. He's just trying to make a buck, this, that, or the other. I feel like he's paid a huge price, and there are much easier ways that you can do it, and probably more pleasant ways than going down the route of a truth seeker.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you look at, he's actually got really bad arthritis. Just look at his hands. You can see it. I mean, they're pretty swollen and uncomfortable. He literally, at this point in time, when he writes his books, he has to sit there and type with like 2 fingers. Can you imagine how much effort that takes to write a book with 2-finger typing? And you know, he actually addressed this perhaps I think it was about 8, maybe 10 years ago, somewhere around there, where he actually was so fed up with people claiming that he's all just about the money and whatever. He actually got a cameraman to come into his home and showed everybody, every room in his house. He showed the office where he worked, the copies of his books on his shelf. They showed his car, which was just an ordinary car, nothing fancy. His apartment wasn't anything expensive or fancy. And he said, what do I need money for anyway? All I'm doing is basically working, and that's my life. I'm either writing books or I'm touring and talking to people. I just want to add this is anytime people do this sort of work full time, how are they supposed to make any sort of living unless they're selling books and being paid to do presenting? There's no other way for them to exist. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not even an argument.
Absolutely. And at some point in time, if the demand for podcasts like this and information sharing such as we're doing gains a high enough demand, we'll need to monetize it as well, just in order to keep going. So, you know, you can't put someone down just for making a basic living and being supported for what they put their heart and soul into. And the other point that I wanted to make too is that David Icke, along with other people that I don't know what you would call it, I would call it a generalist, that they look at the overarching story. So they're not a medical expert, they're not a biologist, they're not a environmental scientist, like they're not a specialist in law or electromagnetic fields or anything. They're looking at lots and lots of different things and generating a global picture out of that. So like you said, they are a good place to start and to guide you into or shine light on areas that you might then want to look deeper into.
Yes. Yeah. This is why we have researchers that do talk to experts so that the experts can explain it in layman's terms for the purpose of journalists and researchers. Yeah. Because you can't be expected to be an expert at everything. No one has the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not even David Icke has the time, and he does this as a full-time occupation. And he doesn't have the time to become an expert at everything. It's not possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just have a look at a few things that he touched on in the interview. Now, the interview, if you decide at home that you're going to watch it, it's 2.5 hours long. It's quite big and quite intense. If you want to only listen to half an hour of it, listen to the last half hour. If you just want the bit that is more empowering and what you can do, just watch the last half hour. But if you feel like you want the long haul, I actually feel like it's worth it. It is pretty heavy, and he's very passionate about his work, and is obviously incredibly frustrated at the world right now because he's seen where it's going for a long time. But we'll just touch on a few little points in it. Now, the conversation was about COVID-19, and one point that he made early on that I found interesting. His basic premise is that there isn't a virus and that the whole thing's a fabrication. I'm not going to say that's right or wrong. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a health professional. I don't know. But there are some things that he mentioned that were quite interesting. And and I've heard other people say this as well, said that it's actually what's called an exosome. And I just had to look this up before to make sure I got that word right. Exizome, if you want to look it up at home. And he said that that is something that cells actually produce. I understand it to be a byproduct of certain stresses. And those stresses can also include, I think, aside from fighting off pathogens in the body, also fear and stress can create the releasing of those exosomes, and so can electromagnetic frequencies. And I found that interesting. And he said that if you look at a picture of an exosome and a picture of what is supposedly COVID-19, they look very, very similar. So I had a quick Google search for exosome images, and I actually found a few that I will pop up on the screen here. But do your own research. So it is possible that either they look exactly the same or they just look similar. The other thing that he said was that exosome actually locks onto the same cell receptor that apparently COVID-19 does. So, Maz, do you have any insight into that particular issue?
Sure. If you go looking around on the internet for any sort of professionals in the medical industry, and it is in industry, you will find a lot of doctors, virologists, and so on that are looking at this very topic and taking it very seriously. There have been studies done in the past that prove at least a connection between electromagnetic frequencies in living beings and disease. Whether it is actually conclusive that the virus itself, as it is called, is a result of what David Icke describes, or if it's a coincidental situation which might be exacerbated by electromagnetic radiation, is up for a little bit of debate. But there are some virologists who are adamant that what David Icke has said in his statements about it, those definitions are correct. So some of the examples that have been provided as anecdotes of how this has happened in the past is various, in quotes, pandemic flus, such as the Spanish flu, the Hong Kong flu, and others. So in the fall of 1917 was the first introduction worldwide of radio. By the beginning of 1918, we had the Spanish flu breakout across the world.
Yeah.
And some of the countries, I mean, you got to keep in mind that back then, you know, we didn't have really air travel. We had shipping, we had horse and carts, basically. There were very few cars around, and international travel was very slow. And yet the reported cases of the flu popped up worldwide within a very short space of time, even as quickly as 2 weeks on other sides of the planet. Then in around World War II, we had the introduction of radar. Then in 1968, we had satellites put up that were bombarding the Earth with frequencies and coinciding with the Hong Kong flu several months later.
Yeah.
So it seems to be there's a certain amount of delay between the radiation blanketing the Earth and then the symptoms, which is approximately 3 to 6 months. And you could chalk that up as just coincidence. However, there are studies that have been done on this, and there are other parts of the equation to look at as well, even if you're not convinced by that argument.
Yeah.
There have been experiments done in the early 1900s about studying how viruses actually spread, how contagious they are, to the point where they were taking mucus from people that were sick with a particular kind of flu, and other people that were not sick, they would actually take the cells and inject them into people, and they found that they wouldn't contract the illness.
Yeah.
They tried the same experiment with horses during the Spanish flu, a derivative of the Spanish flu. They would get one horse that was sick, they would put a bag over its head and sneeze into it, and then take that bag and put it over the head of a healthy horse, and it wouldn't get sick. Then no matter what they did, they would not actually contract it. That's a very early experiment and probably something that's needs a little bit closer scrutiny. But all of these things can be explored for people's own benefit.
Yeah. And 5G is something that we will be looking into. We're actually currently gathering information, case studies and so on about the dangers or potential dangers of 5G. So we're actually going to be talking about this again in a few weeks. So actually, if anybody at home has seen or read any information that is viable, feel free to email that to me. And if you're not sure how to get reliable information, go back to Inspiral Out Loud #1, because that will give you some tips on how to get through the noise and actually find some reliable sources. Now, and just briefly to touch along those lines again, and still relating to the David Icke interview, he was talking about that during this lockdown, he was talking about Elon Musk gaining permission to install something like 1 million more towers across the states. And we've known for a while, I think the plan is something like 80,000 satellites basically blanketing the earth in 5G waves. But I know that the permission for a lot of that rollout has happened during lockdown, and we're seeing quite a few people around the world freaking out because everybody's meant to be in lockdown and these guys are out there installing and activating the towers. And I think, Mars, you said you saw a website that had like a map or something of where 5G has actually been rolled out.
Yeah, there are a couple around actually.
Okay.
They don't have any opinion. They're not listing any sort of opinion at all about health risks or anything. It's just purely a standard kind of mainstream website. There's actually a couple of them. One of them is on lifewire.com. There's another one at actually worldtimezone.com/5G. They're listing when 5G research began, in which areas, trials and testing, partial rollouts or complete commercial rollouts. So they list all of that everywhere.
Sorry, did you see where, how long ago it actually rolled out in Wuhan? Because I heard that preceded COVID-19 quite significantly.
That's right. It actually began in November 2019.
Right. About 3 months before
Yes.
COVID-19 was reported?
Interesting coincidence.
Was that the same with Italy?
Well, according to one of those webs, I think it was Livewire, 5 cities in June of 2019, including Naples, Bologna, how do you pronounce that? Milan, Turin, and Rome. Then you've got in Spain, similar sort of scenario.
So I guess then the point is what use is the knowledge and how can we use it? And I guess that is where we're kind of heading in a few weeks of hoping to put some information together to be able to take some form of action. So there is a direction for this information. I mean, the main thing is right now to stay well. I feel like that's the most important thing. And before I get further into that, is there anything, Mars, that you feel like you want to just touch on with David Icke before we get into that?
Take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, because not because of what information he's providing. I think he's pretty on the money there. I don't want to judge his sort of perspective on where this is all heading. It is not a really a pleasant picture of the way everything is heading, but he hasn't been really wrong in the past when it comes to those sort of conclusions. But I think his message is clear, and the message is we collectively need to stop just accepting what we're told and to get off our derrieres and do something proactive. It's not enough just to know this information. It's useless unless it's applied. And the important thing for people to know is how to be effectively in charge, not servants to the states. Because the states are basically puppets to a deeper system, and they don't necessarily know what they're doing. They don't necessarily know that there is a danger with 5G. There are some politicians who do, but there are obviously some that don't. Probably the vast majority of them. And they can't be expected that they're going to do anything unless people actually tell them this is not acceptable. But you have to use their language and do it in their terms. If you went into a courtroom, there's a certain procedure that you have to follow or you won't get remedy.
Yeah.
It's the same with treating with government.
Yeah. And so you mentioned a few days ago that there is a process that we can put together and help people to take part in that has lawful backing behind it. Is that the correct way to put it?
Yes.
Right.
But the first step for everybody really is learning what's going on. You have to know that first, because that will provide the basis for your argument why 5G needs to be stopped, if that's your position.
So within that, it feels more important than ever right now to really feel into what parts of the world and our life are actually worth holding onto, so that we remember actually what we're fighting for. And when I say fighting for, we really are in an age of information, and the wielding the pen is far mightier than the sword from my perspective. So I feel like it's really important at the moment to educate yourself as much as you can without getting squashed by that, and to balance that with taking the time to really tune into self, to meditate, to write, to get out into nature barefoot, to go and cuddle a tree, to reduce your exposure to EMFs as much as possible. And I'll get into EMFs in another episode, because that's really important. And I feel like a lot of people, especially in the last few days, are suddenly really feeling this sense of not being supported by the powers that are supposed to be supporting them. So I feel like we're really being called very, very strongly right now to vision what it is that we're really wanting to bring through for all sentient beings. We will get into more of all of those bits. The negative, what it is that we're really looking to undo and move away from, and using that as fuel to be able to direct our attention to what it is that we want to create. Because I feel like if all of the attention is just on what you want to fight, you forget what it is that you're actually here for. So any final thoughts on that, Mars?
it's a little like looking at a magician on a stage where he's got one hand doing one thing, and that hand is the one that's flashing around and keeping your eye on it, and the other hand is doing the magic. And with any major situation like what we're facing now, I would just ask people to question or to dig into what is being done that you're not aware of right now while you're being distracted in the state of fear and isolation.
Yeah,
Um,
and that word fear actually is a key one. I feel like the most important thing right now is to not be fearful, because that just creates so much havoc with the immune system and with us on all levels. So really focusing on the positives as much as possible while delving into the truth. Thanks, Maz, for coming and having a chat. And we will pop that David Icke video in the comments below the video for those that would like to watch it, along with a few other things, because we like to balance all of this stuff out. If you would like to subscribe to the newsletters and make sure that you get all the episodes of Inspiral Out Loud, please drop me an email at in-spiral. Sorry, that's info@in-spiral.org. For all of you at home, till next time, my friends, stay well and keep dreaming the good dream. Ciao for now.